I stared at the bank statement in my trembling hands, my world crumbling around me. The numbers blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. 10 years of marriage, and this is what it had come to: lies, deceit, and a secret account filled with money that should have been ours. "Greg," I called out, my voice cracking. "We need to talk. Now." He sauntered into the kitchen, his face a mask of indifference. "What is it, Emily?" "I'm busy." I thrust the paper at him. "Explain this. Why do you have a secret bank account?" Greg's eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is you've been lying to me. How long has this been going on?" He scoffed, snatching the statement from my hand. "You wouldn't understand. Just stay in your lane, Emily." "My lane?" I felt a surge of anger, years of pent-up frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've been your wife for 10 years. I deserve to know the truth." "The truth?" Greg sneered. "The truth is, you can't handle our finances. I'm doing what's best for this family." I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. "Best for the family? Is that what you call gambling away our savings? Or is it funding your affair?" His hand slammed down on the counter, making me flinch. "You're being hysterical. This conversation is over." As he stormed out, I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. How had I let it get this far? For years, I'd ignored the signs, made excuses for his behavior. But now, with the evidence in black and white, I couldn't deny it any longer. I heard Sophie's small voice from the doorway. "Mommy, are you okay?" Looking at my daughter's worried face, I made a decision. This wasn't just about me anymore. I had to protect Sophie, to show her what real strength looked like. I forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. How about we go to the park?" As I watched Sophie play on the swings, my resolve strengthened. I couldn't let her grow up in this toxic environment. It was time to take control of my life, for both our sakes. I pulled out my phone and dialed a familiar number. "Alice? It's Emily. I need your help." The doorbell rang, and my stomach dropped. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Margaret, Greg's mother, stood there with her usual disapproving frown. "Emily, dear," she said, pushing past me into the house. "I hope you've tidied up. This place is a mess." I bit my tongue, reminding myself that she was Sophie's grandmother. "We weren't expecting company, Margaret. What brings you by?" She tooted, running a finger along a dusty shelf. "I'm here to talk some sense into you. Greg tells me you've been difficult lately." My blood boiled. Of course, Greg had gone crying to his mother. Difficult? Is that what he calls it when I question his lies and infidelity? Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Now, Emily, a wife should stand by her husband no matter what. You're failing your duties." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "My duties? Margaret, your son is the one who's failing us. He's been lying and cheating. Every marriage has its challenges," she said dismissively. "It's your job to support Greg, not tear him down." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. Support him in what? Gambling away our savings? Having an affair? Margaret waved her hand as if swatting away an annoying fly. "You're being dramatic. Greg works hard to provide for this family. The least you could do is keep a clean house and be grateful." That was the last straw. Grateful? For what? For being lied to? For watching our future disappear into his secret bank account? Secret bank account? Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "What nonsense are you talking about?" I realized my mistake too late. Greg hadn't told his parents about the account. For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in Margaret's eyes, but it quickly hardened into resolve. "Whatever you think you know, Emily, it doesn't change your responsibilities. A family needs a strong foundation, and that starts with a supportive wife." As she lectured me on the virtues of being a good wife, I felt something shift inside me. I'd spent years trying to please this woman, to fit into her narrow view of what a wife should be. But now, faced with her willful ignorance and blind support of Greg, I knew I couldn't do it anymore. "I think it's time for you to leave, Margaret," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. She looked at me, shocked. Well, I never dash. Goodbye, Margaret, I said, opening the front door. As I watched her car pull away, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. I'd stood up to Margaret for the first time, but I knew there would be consequences. Greg would be furious when he found out. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart racing. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. It was time to call Alice. My hands shook as I dialed Alice's number. After 2 rings, her familiar voice answered. Emily? What's wrong? I took a deep breath. Alice, I need help. I can't stay here anymore. Say no more, she replied without hesitation. Pack your things. You and Sophie can stay with me. Relief washed over me. Thank you, Alice. I don't know what I'd do without you. That's what friends are for. Now listen carefully. We need to plan this carefully. For the next hour, Alice and I strategized. We decided I'd leave while Greg was at work, taking only essentials and important documents. Alice would help me find a lawyer and set up a new bank account. As I hung up, I heard Greg's car in the driveway. Panic seized me. Had he overheard? Emily. Greg's voice boomed through the house. Where are you? I steeled myself and went downstairs. Greg's face was red with anger. I just got off the phone with my mother. What the hell did you say to her? I told her the truth, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Greg advanced on me, his fists clenched. You had no right. Do you have any idea what you've done? For a moment, fear paralyzed me. Then I thought of Sophie, of the life I wanted for her. I stood my ground. I had every right. This is my life too, Greg. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. You're my wife. You do what I say. Suddenly, a small voice piped up. Daddy, stop. You're hurting Mommy. We both turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Greg immediately let go of my arm, his face shifting from anger to shame. Sophie, sweetie, it's okay, I said, moving towards her. Daddy and I were just talking. Greg stormed out of the room, leaving me to comfort our trembling daughter. As I held her, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. We had to leave, and soon. That night, after Sophie was asleep, I quietly packed our bags. I wrote a note to Greg, explaining that we were safe but needed time away. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a mix of fear and determination. Tomorrow, when Greg left for work, Sophie and I would start our new life. It wouldn't be easy, but with Alice's help and my newfound resolve, I knew we could make it. As I crawled into bed, my mind raced with plans and worries. But underneath it all was a glimmer of hope. Hope for a future free from fear, where Sophie and I could thrive. The morning sun barely peeked through the curtains as I gently shook Sophie awake. Sweetheart, it's time to go. Remember our adventure we talked about? Sophie rubbed her eyes, confusion clouding her face. Where are we going, Mommy? We're going to stay with Aunt Alice for a while, I explained, my heart racing. Pack your favorite toys, okay? As Sophie sleepily gathered her things, I double-checked our bags. Passports, birth certificates, bank statements. Everything we'd need for our new life. Will Daddy come too? Sophie asked, clutching her stuffed rabbit. I knelt beside her, fighting back tears. No, sweetheart. It's just us for now. The hurt in her eyes nearly broke my resolve, but I knew we had to leave. Greg's car had left the driveway an hour ago, but I still felt like we were racing against time. We slipped out of the house quietly, our few possessions stuffed into the trunk of my car. As I backed out of the driveway, a wave of emotions hit me. Relief, fear, guilt, and a glimmer of hope. The drive to Alice's felt surreal. Sophie dozed in the back seat while I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Greg's car following us. Alice was waiting on her porch when we arrived. She enveloped me in a tight hug. You did it, Em. You're safe now. As we settled into Alice's guest room, my phone buzzed incessantly. Greg's name flashed on the screen, along with a barrage of text messages. Where are you? Come home now. You can't take Sophie from me. Each message made my hands shake, but I refused to respond. Instead, I called my lawyer, setting the wheels in motion for a restraining order and divorce proceedings. That evening, as Sophie played with Alice's cat, oblivious to the turmoil, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at job listings on Alice's laptop. "I've got an opening at my company," Alice said, sliding a mug of tea towards me. "It's entry-level, but it's a start." Gratitude washed over me. "Alice, I can't thank you enough." "You can thank me by thriving," she replied with a smile. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Sophie's soft breathing, I felt a mix of terror and exhilaration. We'd taken the first step towards freedom, but I knew the hardest part was yet to come. Greg wouldn't let us go without a fight. Tomorrow I'd start my new job. Tomorrow we'd begin building our new life. But for now, in the quiet darkness of Alice's guest room, I allowed myself a moment of pride. We'd made it this far. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. I was just settling into my new routine at Alice's company when my phone buzzed. Greg's name flashed on the screen. My stomach churned as I answered. "Emily, bring Sophie back. You're tearing this family apart." Greg's voice was a mix of anger and desperation. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "No, Greg. You did that yourself. We're not coming back. You can't do this," he shouted. "I'll fight you for custody. I'll tell everyone what a terrible mother you are." His threats sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to let him see my fear. "Go ahead, Greg. I have nothing to hide. You're the one with secrets." I hung up, my hands shaking. Alice found me in the break room, trying to compose myself. What happened?" she asked, concern etched on her face. I told her about Greg's call, the threats, the fear that was threatening to overwhelm me. Alice listened, then squeezed my hand. "We'll get through this," she assured me. "I've got a friend who's a great family lawyer. Let's give her a call." That evening, as Sophie played in the living room, I sat with Alice and her lawyer friend, Linda. We discussed restraining orders, custody battles, and financial settlements. The reality of what lay ahead hit me hard. "Emily," Linda said gently, "I need to ask, was Greg ever physically abusive?" I hesitated. There had been times when Greg's anger had scared me, when he'd grabbed my arm too tightly or thrown things in rage. But he'd never hit me. Did that count? He was controlling, I finally said. He made me feel small, worthless. But he never hit me. Linda nodded. "Emotional abuse is still abuse, Emily. We can use this in your case." As we talked strategy, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Sophie's school. Greg had shown up, demanding to see her. The school had refused, following my instructions, but they were concerned. Panic rose in my throat. "He's going after Sophie," I choked out. Alice and Linda exchanged glances. "Emily," Linda said firmly, "we need to file for an emergency custody order. Tonight." I looked at Sophie, happily coloring, oblivious to the storm raging around her. In that moment, I knew I had to be stronger than I'd ever been. "Do it," I told Linda. "Whatever it takes. I'm not letting him hurt Sophie." As Linda made calls and Alice comforted me, I felt a strange mix of terror and determination. This was war, and I was ready to fight. For Sophie, for myself, for the life we deserved. That night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she asked, "Mommy, when are we going home?" I kissed her forehead, fighting back tears. "We are home, sweetheart. This is our home now." As I closed her door, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever Greg threw at us, I would face it head-on. Our future depended on it. The doorbell rang, shattering the peaceful Saturday morning. My heart leapt into my throat as I peered through the peephole. Greg stood there, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Sophie, go to your room," I whispered urgently. She looked at me, confused and scared, but obeyed. I opened the door, leaving the chain on. "Greg, you can't be here. There's a restraining order." "To hell with your restraining order," he snarled, pushing against the door. "You have no right to keep Sophie from me." The chain strained against his force. I braced myself against the door, panic rising. "And you have no right to ruin her life. Leave us alone, Greg." "I'm her father," he roared. "Open this door or I swear I'll break it down." I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "I'm calling the police, Greg. You need to leave. Now." He laughed bitterly. "Go ahead, call them. I'll tell them how you kidnapped our daughter, how you're an unfit mother." As I spoke to the dispatcher, Greg continued his tirade, each word cutting deeper than the last. I heard Sophie crying in her room, and my resolve hardened. "The police are on their way," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If you're not gone when they arrive, you'll be arrested." For a moment, Greg fell silent. Then, in a voice dripping with venom, he said, "This isn't over, Emily. I'll take Sophie from you if it's the last thing I do." I watched through the peephole as he stormed off, my whole body trembling. When I was sure he was gone, I rushed to Sophie's room. She flung herself into my arms, sobbing. "Mommy, I'm scared. Why was Daddy so angry?" I held her tight, fighting back my own tears. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're safe. Daddy's just having a hard time right now." As I comforted Sophie, my mind raced. Greg's threats echoed in my ears. Would he really try to take Sophie? Could he? The thought of losing her was unbearable. The police arrived minutes later, taking my statement and assuring me they'd keep an eye on the house. But their presence did little to quell my fears. That night, after Sophie had finally fallen asleep, I sat in the dark living room, my nerves frayed to breaking point. The day's events played on loop in my mind. Greg's rage, Sophie's tears, the terrifying possibility of losing my daughter. I knew then that this was far from over. Greg wouldn't stop, and I couldn't live in constant fear. Something had to change. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. As it rang, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew I had to do. "Mom," I said when she answered, my voice cracking. "I need your help. We can't stay here anymore." The drive to my parents' house was tense, with Sophie quietly coloring in the back seat and my mind racing with fears of what Greg might do next. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw Mom and Dad waiting on the porch, their faces etched with concern. "Emily, sweetheart," Mom said, embracing me tightly. "We're so glad you're here." Dad scooped up Sophie, his eyes misty. "Hey there, pumpkin. Grandpa's missed you."
Once inside, with Sophie occupied by Dad's storytelling, Mom pulled me aside. "Emily, there's something we need to talk about. Something I should have told you long ago." Her tone sent a chill down my spine. "What is it, Mom?" She took a deep breath. "Emily Ray, he's not your biological father." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What? But how?" "I was married before, to a man named Robert," Mom explained, her voice trembling. "He was abusive. I left him when I was pregnant with you." I stared at her, struggling to process this bombshell. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I wanted to protect you," she said, tears in her eyes. "But now, it's time for you to know your strength comes from within." Leaving was the hardest, but best decision I ever made. As the shock wore off, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. "You escaped an abusive marriage just like I'm doing now." Mom nodded, squeezing my hand. "And look at me now. I found love with Ray, built a beautiful life. You can do the same, Emily." Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Greg. "I know where you are. I'm coming for Sophie." Panic surged through me. "Mom, Greg's coming. He knows we're here." Dad overheard and immediately sprang into action, locking doors and closing curtains. Sophie, sensing the tension, clung to me. "We need to call the police," Dad said firmly. As sirens wailed in the distance, I held Sophie close, my mind reeling. The revelation about my mother's past, Greg's imminent arrival, the fear of losing Sophie, it all swirled together in a dizzying vortex. But beneath the fear, I felt something else stirring. A strength I hadn't known I possessed, passed down from my mother. A determination to break the cycle, to give Sophie the life she deserved. As blue lights flashed outside and heavy footsteps approached the door, I stood tall. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it.
For Sophie.
For myself. for the legacy of strength my mother had unknowingly bestowed upon me. The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would define our future. With trembling hands but steely resolve, I reached for the doorknob, ready to confront whatever, or whoever, waited on the other side. A year had passed since that fateful night at my parents' house. As I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, watching Sophie happily eat her breakfast, I marveled at how much had changed. The custody battle had been brutal. Greg had thrown everything he had at us: lies, manipulations, even attempts to turn Sophie against me. But with the support of my family, Alice, and my ironclad determination, we'd prevailed. The judge had seen through Greg's facade, granting me full custody with Greg allowed only supervised visits. I'd throw myself into my work at Alice's company, quickly rising through the ranks. The skills I'd always possessed but Greg had dismissed were finally being recognized and valued. "Mom, can we go to the park after school?" Sophie asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, my heart swelling with love. She'd been through so much, yet her resilience amazed me daily. The doorbell rang, and Alice walked in, a wide smile on her face. "Look at you, Emily. You've come so far." I hugged her tightly. "I couldn't have done it without you and Mom. Thank you for believing in me." As we chatted over coffee, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Greg's mother, Margaret. My stomach clenched, old fears threatening to resurface. But as I read the message, a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying lifted from my shoulders. "Greg's in rehab," I told Alice, my voice a mix of relief and sadness. "Margaret says he's finally getting help for his gambling addiction." Alice squeezed my hand. "How do you feel about that?" I paused, considering. Relieved, mostly, for Sophie's sake. And I hope he finds peace. Later that evening, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she asked, "Mommy, are you happy now?" I kissed her forehead, tears pricking my eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm very happy. Are you?" She nodded sleepily. "I like our new home, and I like seeing you smile." As I closed her door, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me was stronger, more confident than I'd ever been. She'd faced her fears, fought for her child, and reclaimed her life. I thought of my mother's revelation, of the strength that ran through our family's veins. I thought of Alice's unwavering support, of the new life we'd built from the ashes of the old. There would be challenges ahead, I knew, but for the first time in years, I faced the future not with fear, but with hope and determination. I was Emily, daughter, mother, survivor, and I was ready for whatever came next.